Today's lesson is going to look at the results of the American Revolution for various constituencies within the U.S. population, as well as some larger thematic elements such as ideas, politics, and economics. First, we need to consider what a revolution actually consists of. Most Americans assume that America's most fundamental and radical change came as a result of the American Revolution. In some ways, this is legitimate. But the concept of democracy is in no way new. What was different was that the U.S. had decided to try it out on a larger scale, and few outside of America believed that was possible, and even inside of America there were many skeptics. It is important to note here that the concept of democracy can be traced back to not only the Greeks and the Romans, but also tribes and cultures throughout the world, including Native American groups, some of whom practiced forms of government that allowed for group decision-making and shared responsibilities amongst group members. But democracy can be, and generally is, quite messy even on a small scale. So the question becomes, was the revolution the incredible life change it is considered to be? Well, let's find out. We are going to consider 9 different categories of change and consider how each category amounts to a revolution. First, let's consider African Americans. Slavery persisted both before and after the Revolution, which, as we've emphasized before, is a paradox. But it also shows a lack of change due to the Revolution. How can slavery and freedom exist at the same time? This question is not easily answerable, but a few things are important to consider. 1. The British promised freedom to African Americans who fought for the crown. Assuming that the Brits would have followed through with this promise, had the war been won by the British, wouldn't being freed be the real revolution for enslaved African Americans? Second, this hypocrisy was not lost on the Founding Fathers, as well as many average Americans. Most, including those who owned slaves themselves, recognized the paradox of slavery and freedom, meaning that in the years that followed the Revolution, individuals, states, and government actors had to consider how America was going to move forward, claiming to be the land of the free, yet also the home of slavery. Some found ways to rationalize the inconsistency and justified the continuance of slavery through racist ideology. Northern states would begin to make slavery illegal, and several decades later, abolitionist ideas would start to spread. And much of this was based on the idea that if America stands for freedom, individualism, and opportunity, how can it persist in continuing to allow for slavery? But the bottom line is, real changes regarding slavery began long after the Revolution. So for enslaved Africans in America, the Revolution did not change their position, and whatever good came from democracy was not felt by African Americans in this era. Next, we have Loyalists. What the average American does not realize is that Loyalists persisted in every colony, and many even fought for the British. Loyalists were grossly persecuted after the Revolution, which, while not strange after a war ends, was again inconsistent with the values of democracy. Loyalists were banished from town, stripped of their possessions and property, and some were even physically beaten or even killed. Many ended up escaping to Canada or the British mainland. Loyalists had conservative values and believed that America's new, more democratic value structure would create chaos because of power being divided up by so many different people. It turns out they were right. When the Loyalist presence was removed, many historians believe it allowed for the most glaring weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation to become acceptable. But was the Revolution revolutionary for them? Well, yes. They lost almost everything, and their lives changed dramatically. But the radical change they experienced was not a positive one. The general assumption would be that wealthy white males would be the ones who would benefit most obviously from the Revolution, which is probably true. But was it revolutionary? Let's consider who held power before and after the Revolution. While the King and Parliament held the overriding authority over the colonies, for the vast majority of colonial history, the British did not have dramatic control over the day-to-day lives of local citizens. Colonial legislatures held that power, and those members were typically wealthy, landowning colonial citizens. After the Revolution, the burdens that were placed on the colonial legislatures from Parliament and the King following the French and Indian War were gone. And that was an important change for the wealthy elites within the colonies. But the actual core of political power, which were in the hands of wealthy landowning males, remained the same. colonial legislatures became state legislatures, and oftentimes the very same person who held that power before the Revolution continued to hold it in the newly created state legislatures after the Revolution. If there is a great revolution for American women, it would probably be over 200 years after the 1770s. The new principles of democratic government post-revolution did not give women the right to vote, hold office, or play any direct decision-making role. Before the revolution, women were more or less forced to be subservient to their father or husband, or sometimes even brothers or cousins, especially from a legal and financial standpoint. The revolution did not change any of that. However, in the average wealthy or middle-class white American household, women gradually began to be given a new role, which was education. Women began to be considered important in their role of educating their children to be part of an educated electorate, a role commonly referred to as Republican motherhood. So, although women's roles in American society may not have amounted to a revolution, the change in regards to educating children gave women influence over the new republic. As for the Native American tribes, while it is important to remember that tribes had distinctive cultures and societies from each other, they did have one thing in common when it comes to the American Revolution. Virtually none of the tribes benefited from the new American government. Not even the tribes who sided with the colonials in the Revolutionary War. Tribal societies generally benefited more from British protection in the pre-revolutionary period. Recall, for example, the Proclamation of 1763 was meant to give tribes their own territory, something the colonials greatly resented. Similarly, the new American government did not give Native tribes power or influence or their own territory, thereby continuing, rather than revolutionizing, the poor relationship between Americans and Native tribes. The Revolution is most clearly seen by most as a radical change in ideas. So let's consider this. European societies had generally ruled by the divine right of kings, the idea that God granted special privilege to royalty to create rules and make decisions on behalf of the people. The American Revolution, then later revolutions such as the French Revolution, would challenge this notion and create more democratic governments. Without question, this is an important and perhaps revolutionary change. However, what about freedom? This is a more complex term than it sounds. While Americans now had freedom from the rules and taxes of the British Parliament and were no longer ruled by what radicals referred to as a tyrant, freedom for others within the United States was more elusive, particularly for enslaved people. Besides, how much freedom is too much? To what extent does the government have the right to tell us what to do? These are questions we are still asking 250 years later. While the assumption is that the political system experienced a radical change after the Revolution, there are some limitations with this. Realistically, the system the United States created was fundamentally similar to the British system, as it remains to this day. The most glaring difference is that the monarchy or executive was not an inherited position. Additionally, those given the power to rule were members of the American citizenry and were no longer ruled by political bodies across an ocean. But as previously mentioned, the actual people who held power within the states were similar to those who held power prior to the Revolution, when those states were colonies. Additionally, the way Americans gathered resources and made money remained fundamentally the same. The United States continued to be a primarily agricultural society, and despite insisting on the tyrannical nature of the British Parliament, who insisted that Americans not be allowed to manufacture their own goods, Americans did not begin to manufacture their own goods on a large scale until well into the 19th century. Additionally, Americans would continue their most lucrative trade relationship with their major trading partner, Britain, a partnership that continued well into the next 2 centuries and continues today. Also, although America was now independent and free to trade with other countries, basic trading partners and practices changed minimally because of the Revolution. In terms of the economy, the Revolution was definitely not revolutionary. Finally, the average colonial American identified primarily in terms of their religious affiliation. Let's consider how these various denominations were regarded after the Revolution. Anglicans lost the most power because of the Revolution. As members of the Church of England, many were loyalists, So Anglicans were condemned post-Revolution, and citizens no longer had to pay taxes to the Church of England. Quakers were typically regarded as outsiders before the Revolution, and this was only worsened after the Revolution because as pacifists, many Quakers refused to fight during the war. Roman Catholics actually gained a bit more respect than usual because France was a Catholic country in the 1770s. Americans were grateful for France's help during the war. Most historians believe that America could not have won were it not for the French alliance. But there was no major reshuffling of religious groups' influence over American society. In fact, American religious diversity was notable and unique both before and after the American Revolution. So, it is up to you to think about the degree to which you believe the Revolution amounted to a radical change. Without question, however, many aspects of American life remained virtually unchanged after the Revolution. Women went back to their subservient roles, slaves remained enslaved, and the economy remained virtually unchanged. Consider that during the Civil War, the end of slavery forced the economy to change fundamentally, and the status of free African Americans was in flux. The northern states had begun to modernize, and businesses, as well as technologies, continued to grow exponentially. Also, consider that during the Revolutionary War, not all colonists fought on the side of the Patriots. Although British soldiers and other European groups fought on the American continent during the Revolution, many colonists were on the British side. Therefore, it is possible that the Civil War was more of a revolution and the Revolutionary War more of a civil war, battling for control of the American colonies. This is just another example of how, while the past cannot change, our interpretation of those events and how we piece them together is continually in flux.